Term limits for lawmakers. We have them for the president and many positions here in Colorado. And now there's a renewed discussion at the national level on if it makes sense. We're going 360 this afternoon to look at all the arguments. We elect people at the local, state, and national level to make decisions for us, whether it's how to spend taxpayer money or change laws. The subject of limiting the time people can spend in office is something that comes up in Washington and beyond. But other levels of government have limits, including state and local offices here in Colorado. But first, some background. At the congressional level, the Supreme Court ruled term limits unconstitutional in 1995, meaning anyone elected to the U.S. House or Senate can remain in that office as long as they're re-elected either every 2 years in the House or every 6 years in the Senate. The Supreme Court ruling impacted a ballot initiative Colorado voters passed in 1990 to limit the time congressional, state, and local elected leaders spend in office, which means from 1995 to now, term limits at the state and local level remain. Most offices are limited to 8 years, which usually means 2 or 4 terms depending on the office.
I think political scientists are often critical of some of these arguments for term limits because they think that the goal isn't actually going to be accomplished. Because sometimes what
political science professor Josh Dunn at UCCS says there are a few different arguments both for and against limiting time in office. Those who think they're a good idea say it limits so-called career politicians. People against them argue it puts power in other places in government, such as the executive branch and lobbyists, and there are other ways for people not to remain in office.
They argue that, well, we actually do have a system of term limits. They're called elections. Right?
Bridget Serrit is the Colorado director for U.S. term limits.
Incumbents tend to win almost every election that they are put into because we just vote based on name recognition.
She says by limiting time in office, it eliminates people not making decisions in the best interests for constituents.
Why do we have a system that requires decades of expertise knowledge? It's not working out for us now.
Groups like Common Cause Colorado say term limits are one part of a larger equation when it comes to accurate representation.
At the end of the day, we want to make sure that everyone has equal voice in their government.
Amanda Gonzalez says things like redistricting and term limits can play a bigger role in making sure people in Congress are representing constituents.
And with or without term limits, to succeed, our democracy needs all of those parts.
Senator Ted Cruz from Texas recently proposed amending the Constitution to add term limits on members of Congress. Colorado's term limits, for the most part, are in place in local governments, but some places have voted to eliminate term limits for certain positions and allow elected officials to remain in office beyond the state terms. And some experts tell me, too, they're really going to be looking closely at that redistricting process this year because that's also going to play a role in ultimately the balance of power in Congress and who represents our state in Washington. One interesting note, though, when it comes to Colorado's term limits, the Constitution says terms are consecutive if there are less than 4 years in between. We've seen this done before. Someone serves a term limit, waits 4 years, and then runs again for that same office. Now, if you have an idea you'd like us to look into for our next 360 perspective, just send an email to news@KOAA.com.